down and start over here. All right, so the Philistines are now fleeing back to the land, their land, after Saul has, after the Lord saved Israel that day, in verse 23. So the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul had placed the people under oath. And the oath was, "Cursed is the man who eats any food until evening, before I have taken vengeance on my enemies." So none of the people tasted food. All right, rash oath is what it's called. It's obviously a foolish vow, something that Saul has come up with on his own. We have no indications at all this was anything that he sought from the Lord. This is just something that he wanted to go for. It certainly is not going to prove to be helpful or good or productive in any way. The oath is no one is going to eat anything. So these people are out doing battle, hard physical labor out there doing battle, and they're not allowed to eat at all. So that puts them at a distinct disadvantage. So all of the people of the land came to the forest, and there was honey on the ground. Right, so that sets into mind, more than likely, what happened was that there were honeycombs built up into the trees, and the honey would have seeped down and covered the ground. So there was an ample supply of honey on the ground. And when the people came into the woods and there was honey dripping, but no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. One of the things about honey is that it's immediate energy, right? Mm-hmm. It's immediate sugar release. And so it would have been something that would have supplemented them in a really quick, immediate way from not having had anything at all to eat. But they were all afraid to do it because of what Saul had said. Verse 27, but Jonathan had not heard his father charge the people with an oath, and therefore he stretched out the end of the rod that was in his hand, and he dipped it in the honeycomb. And he put his hand to his mouth, and his countenance brightened. So Jonathan didn't know that his dad had made this foolish oath. He obviously just takes whatever, sticks it in the honey, and then eats it, and immediately he feels better, gets a little sugar rush, feels great, his countenance brightens. 28, and one of the people said, "Ooh, your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, 'Cursed is the man who eats this day.'" And the people were faint or exhausted. So that's the first time Jonathan hears what his father has done. 29, and Jonathan says, "My father has troubled the land. Look now, how my countenance is brightened, because I tasted a little of the honey." So Jonathan is, there's a little bit of argument that goes on about whether this was right or wrong. Obviously, Jonathan's making a statement that is true. He's also making a negative statement against his father, and he's making a negative statement against the king. Both of those probably not great. However, the statement that he makes is very true there. This is not a good thing that his father has done. 30, how much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies which they found, and now would there not have been an even much greater slaughter among the Philistines? Just reasonable, right? If they would have been able to eat, take some of the meat, cook it, eat it, fill themselves, they would have had the energy and the strength to go on and do even more than what had happened there. So, 31, now they had driven back the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ahajalon, so the people were very faint, exhausted from their work. 32, and the people rushed on the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. All right, so we're going to camp here for just a minute. We're going to spend a little bit of time. Verse 14, in your packet on 14, I provided you with a little information. I don't know if anyone had an opportunity to look at it. It talks about why that was a big deal. Why, if you eat the flesh of an animal before the blood has properly drained out of it, which is what kosher butchering is all about, is first of all killing, slaughtering the animal in a merciful way, and then draining the blood out of it. Why? Well, Because the life is in the blood, yes, definitely, and because the blood was always sacrificed to the Lord. The blood and the fat belong to the Lord, always. And so, so the blood would be of a slaughtered animal that was sacrificed would be drained out and then poured around the altar. So 2 reasons, because the life is in the blood, and because the life is in the blood, and because God gives life to everything, that blood belongs to the Lord. The flesh could be consumed and eaten, but the blood, where the life stemmed from, came from the Lord and went back to the Lord. And so that was something that he taught them very early on. So if you look in your packet, I gave you some information. I didn't put where it was from. It's in Genesis, early on, I think about chapter 8, and it says this is when God's talking to Noah in the packet, and he's telling them, now I'm giving you everything is under your jurisdiction. Everything that lives and moves will be food for you. Many people believe that up until this time, creation was vegetarian, didn't eat meat, but now after this, Noah, everything is fair game. Just as I gave you the green plants, he tells Noah, to eat, now I'm going to give you the everything to eat. But here's the important part in verse 4. But you must not eat meat that has lifeblood still in it. And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal. And from each human being, too, I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. And then he begins to tell about how important it is, whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed.
Question.
Yes.
But didn't they know that?
That
so
what?
Why did they do what they did?
Why did Noah know that? Is that what you're asking?
Back Samuel.
You're back to Samuel? Absolutely they did. And that's why we're setting this information out. Because, and so let's keep going just a little bit and we're going to answer your question. So look at Leviticus chapter 17, and he talks about this whole idea of eating blood. Look at verse 10. It says, and whatever man of the house of Israel or of the strangers who dwell among you eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood, and I will cut him off from among the people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is blood that makes atonement for the soul. Therefore I say to the children of Israel, no one among you shall eat blood, nor shall any stranger who dwells among you eat blood. You can keep reading on there. This goes over and over in Leviticus. Remember, God is given, having just finished 6 weeks in the feasts of the Lord, and how those are all a picture of what is to come, and of Jesus Christ, and how the Passover and the unleavened bread and all of the feasts were to be a picture of Jesus for the people to recognize when he came. This too, this blood atonement and the importance of what blood does is a picture not only for that moment, but for what's to come. When the blood atonement that comes will make the final sacrifice. So it's very important that they learn it from the grassroots, so that they recognize life is in the blood, because there's going to come a time where God himself is going to give blood for an atonement, and they need to recognize the importance of that.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So when you buy kosher meat in the market, that means the blood's been drained out of it?
Yes.
I never knew what that was.
Yes, it's been properly killed, it's been properly drained, and everything's been done according to the laws.
I didn't realize.
Absolutely.
Isn't all our meat supposedly done?
It's not all. We do not mercifully kill our animals in the slaughterhouses, and we really don't have any. We are supposed to drain them.
Yeah.
We don't have anyone that necessarily. I mean, I don't know that that's done always. I have no really way of knowing it. But I do know that if you're a kosher butcher, you have to be inspected by someone who knows the laws of kashrut and how to slaughter animals and drain them, and they have to be inspected, and so that you know for a surety that it's been done according to law.
But we shouldn't be eating blood pudding, huh?
Well, you know, this is a law in the Old Testament. I personally feel like if blood was important to God then, I don't see that changing.
No.
I think that the life of animals and the life of human beings is still in the blood. And I think that that's a really critical thing. I think that when we talk about eternity and it talks about flesh and bone, but does not mention blood, there's a reason there. I've told you guys this before. I would love to do a really in-depth study on blood. I think there's a lot there that we don't know and we don't truly understand that comes from God in that. But I personally would not feel comfortable eating blood pudding or anything that has to do with that.
Butcher,
Yeah.
you get the blood out as fast as you can
Yes.
to cool
Yeah.
the animal. Otherwise, it clots.
Yeah.
Yeah, the meat's bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so God was very clear about this. And then Deuteronomy chapter 12, you can do some reading there. It goes into quite a bit of detail as to why God wanted them not to eat blood. And it's also very important to recognize that God says there will be punishment if you do that. I will cut you off from amongst your people. And not only that, but if you even have strangers that live in your house and you allow them to do it, I will cut them off. So there is a very strict, harsh punishment for eating blood.
Remember too in Acts when Peter and the elders made the decision on what
Yes.
laws would be expected of the Gentiles. That was the one of
Yes.
the three that Gentiles were not allowed to do.
That's exactly right. The Noahic laws, the laws that God gives to Noah, who is not a child of Israel, remember. Noah's not a Jew. And the same laws that he gives to Noah are the same laws that she's talking about in Acts when he says, okay, give to the poor and don't eat blood. And there's one more, which I've forgotten.
It was a sexual thing.
Okay. And so, and he said, as long as the Gentiles will just do that, then they're not, you know, then we'll consider that good at that time. So it was the same laws that came to Noah. So I wanted you to look at that information because I wanted you to understand that when the children of Israel, who knew all of this stuff, Debbie, that you just mentioned, they knew all of this. They knew the punishment for doing this and what that meant, chose to do it anyway. It tells you the harshness of the oath that Saul created that day, that they went in, grabbed the animals, and began to eat them before they had properly taken the blood out of them. And
So we're going to blame Saul.
well, it's a terrible, no. Actually, the people knew better than to do it, but this oath that Saul had done, had put up on them, certainly drove them to do it. Did they know enough to not do it? Absolutely, they did. They knew enough. They knew the law well enough not to do that. But as a leader of the people, oftentimes you bear the responsibility for what you do for your, you know, where your people oftentimes will go.
But he did cause them to do that.
By the oath that he had for them.
That wasn't
That's right.
needed.
Okay,
So-
so this would be then a day of fasting, really.
Well,
If
a
we-
forced fasting.
Forced fasting.
But they had been in
Battle.
battle all day.
Would
That's
this-
different.
Cover women and children.
It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. I'm assuming that it's the soldiers. I'm assuming that it's he's talking to the army that's out there actually doing the work. It doesn't say that specifically, but these men certainly knew that they were not to be eating it with the blood. And then in 33 it says, and they told Saul, saying, look, the people are sinning against the Lord. So it is definitely against the Lord by eating the blood. So Saul says, you have dealt treacherously, roll a large stone to me this day. So he knows immediately you have transgressed. You have created iniquity. You have sinned, basically is what he's saying. Saul knows that that's not what they are to do. 34, go ahead.
What's the stone?
Well, what does roll the large stone to
Okay,
mean?
we're gonna see. We're going to get to that. It's
I
an
know.
altar
I got
that's going to be built, but we're gonna get there. So he tells them, "Roll the stone to me this day." So he says, right now, Go get a large stone and bring it here. So we'll see what he's going to do with it. 34, and Saul says, disperse yourselves among the people and say to them, bring me here every man's ox and every man's sheep. Slaughter them here and eat, and do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood. So every one of the people brought his ox with him that night and slaughtered it there. Now, here we go to 35. It's going to answer your question. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord, and this was the first altar that he built to the Lord. So he's attempting to get the people to do this the correct way. Can Saul legally build an altar? Actually, he can.
Yes.
Building an altar is not something that only a Levite would have to do. You can build an altar there. What you can't do is perform worshiping sacrifice as a non-Levite. You can't do that, but building an altar created a new high place. You'll see that over and over, that term, a high place. It's an altar that's used for that. And then Saul says, let us go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them until the morning light. And let us not leave a man of them. And they said, do whatever seems good to you. Then the priest said, let us draw near to God here. All right, so Saul is coming up with a plan that is a little bit unusual. He wants to go in at night and go in and attack the Philistines until the morning. That's an unusual way to do it. Normally they would go in at first light when you could see, and he's come up with a different plan, and the people said that seems pretty good. And so when the priest says, let us draw near to God here, what is he talking about? Through the ephod again. Through that communication with God. So Saul asks counsel of God and says, shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you deliver them into the hand of Israel? So these are the type of questions that are asked of the Urim and the Thummim through the high priest. These type of questions are the type that God would normally answer through the high priest. But he did not answer him that day. So it wasn't like rubbing a genie's lamp and immediately a genie pops out and answers and gives you wishes and answers your questions. God certainly has the jurisdiction and the right to decide how he answers, why he answers, and when he answers. And this was not the day. And Saul said, come over here, all you chiefs of the people, and know and see what this sin was today. And so Saul seems to recognize that there is sin amongst the camp that is causing the silence of God. At least that's either what the priest is telling him, that's what he understands. In some way, Saul knows that the silence from the Lord is coming because there is some type of transgression amongst the camp that's causing the silence. For as the Lord lives who saves Israel, though it be Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. But there was not a man among all of the people answered him. So here we have a second time that Saul makes a rash oath. He says, whoever it is out there that's caused this problem, even if it's Jonathan my son, he's going to die. Okay, as a leader, you need to be a little contained. You need to not be making these rash statements, especially if the Lord is not directing him to do this. So once again, we see Saul saying something that he shouldn't be saying. Then he said to all of Israel, you be on one side, and my son Jonathan and I will be on the other side. And the people said to Saul, do what seems good to you. This is where I got mixed up on our last story. So what he's telling them is divide up. You've got the people on one side and you've got my family on the other. And we're going to see where the problem lies. You have to know that Saul never dreamed it would be his side when he makes this division. So Saul said to the Lord God of Israel, give a perfect lot. This is that statement I was telling you. You have to know that he's talking about the Urim and the Thummim here. Perfection and lights. Give a perfect lot. So that is where it's another way of saying that they once again are seeking, whether it's through lot, through the, and however it's being done, they're seeking that answer. So Saul and Jonathan were taken, but the people escaped. So somehow God points to Saul and Jonathan as where the trouble is. And Saul says, cast lots between my son Jonathan and me. And so they're dividing up. So Jonathan was taken, another word would be chosen. Jonathan was chosen. Then Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you've done." Jonathan told him and said, "I only tasted a little honey with the end of the rod that was in my hand. So now I must die?" Question or exclamation, either one. It's a shocking thing
Incredulous.
that he has done that. Saul answered and said, "God do so and more also, for you shall surely die, Jonathan." So having made the rash oath, he now feels that he has no other choice but to do it. Rather than recognize it was a terrible oath, Jonathan didn't know anything about it. He actually was the better for having done it. The people were the worse for having obeyed him. Saul continues to go along this road that he's chosen. He refuses to repent, turn around, come back, recognize that he made an error, and he's just making it worse. Pride, absolutely. And but now in verse 44, but the people said to Saul, "Shall Jonathan die, who has accomplished this great deliverance in Israel? Certainly not. As the Lord lives, not one hair of his head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day." So the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die.
They recognized him as a godly man.
They certainly did. Now, if you are the people and the king, you're saying this to the king, what's going on? How do you feel?
You don't feel respect for your king.
You don't feel respect. Do you think it's a very scary thing
Yeah,
to
it
stand
goes
up
both
to
ways.
the king? I mean,
Absolutely.
he could very easily say, then you die, and you're dead, and you're dead, and you're dead, and you're dead for standing up for him. And yet, I have to believe that God is in charge of this situation and is causing these people to stand up. God has a plan for Jonathan. We're going to see in coming chapters that God uses Jonathan in a very mighty way. And so he has a plan for Jonathan. And so he causes these people to stand up, take Jonathan's side and say, and in a strong way, they say not one hair on his head is going to be harmed. In no way are you going to punish him. Saul seems to accept that. We don't really know how he responds. I kind of see him stomping his feet and turning and walking away. But, we're not told exactly how he responds. We do know that Jonathan is saved. He's redeemed that day from what was going to happen to him. In verse 40.
Interesting. He had the favor of the people.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
Because he was brave. He had gone up and fought the Philistines. He's the one that created this whole situation where the Philistines began to fight against each other and they were able to overcome them. And these were arch enemies of theirs. They recognized and knew that it was Jonathan. And so he does have their favor.
But it was mercy of God, too, to
Right.
give Saul this picture of himself so he'd repent.
Yes.
He didn't.
Absolutely.
It would cost his son's life.
Absolutely.
And he still wouldn't.
And he still wouldn't come back and repent. So what does that tell you about what is happening to Saul?
It's crazy.
His heart is hardening, isn't it? We talked about it. That repeated sin makes your heart hard. And so we can see that Saul, one after another, is doing things at this time that's creating that. That oath that caused so much trouble nearly cost the life of his son. And it's only because the people stepped up that they were saved. So then verse 47 begins to talk about Saul's continuing wars. It's a summary of what's happened there. Saul was able to establish a good army. It says he established his sovereignty over Israel and fought against all the enemies on every side. These are the common enemies of Israel, from Moab, the people of Ammon, Edom, Zobah, Philistines. Wherever he turned, he harassed them or made it bad for them. So God gives him still, to this point, God gives him favor when he's out at war. And Israel is able to overcome many of the enemies that they have dealt with. And he gathered an army and he attacked the Amalekites We're going to talk about that today here in just a minute. And delivered Israel from the hands of those who plundered them. And then he begins to just tell the names, the sons of Saul, and he lists those, the daughters of Saul, and he lists those, and the name of Saul's wife. Someone just asked about it. Sherry, I think it was you. There's her name. That's really all we know. Abner is the son of Ner, who is Saul's uncle. You might underline that. We're going to learn a lot about Abner. Abner's going to be a prominent character. Kish, we heard about him. Of course, he's the father of Saul. It just begins to give a summary of the family of Saul. 52, there was a fierce war with the Philistines all the days of Saul. And when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he took him for himself. And so he's always recruiting. He's always recruiting the best, the strongest, the greatest. He's building up a great army. Remember earlier we read a scripture that it said, and in the days of Samuel, that the Philistines were somewhat contained in there. And now we read that in the days of Saul, there was a fierce war with the Philistines. And boy, as we move along through, even into 2 Samuel and through all of that, you're going to see the Philistines just keep coming back. They are a mighty enemy of Israel. All right. Any questions on that? We might turn this off as we read chapter 15. Does anyone have any questions on 14 or comments about it? How do you feel about Saul at this point?